I probably should have started my YouTube tutorial era with the Didymus plush, because he is the easiest of Sarah's plush toys to make. That's because we're not making a plush toy from scratch. We're customizing an existing one, which is exactly what they did for the original Didymus plush used in Labyrinth. Sarah's Didymus is a red squirrel plush, named Ricky, that was made by the Steiff Toy Company starting in the late 70s. Labyrinth's prop builders just added white fur and the little outfit to turn him into Didymus. Special thanks to Rebecca of My Steiff Life for her help in confirming the production dates of the Ricky plush. I picked up a Steiff Ricky for a decent price a few years ago because he wasn't in pristine condition. Missing tags, slight gray staining, imperfections that not only made him undesirable for collectors, but also made me feel less guilty about modifying a vintage plush. In the years since I got my Ricky, the prices on these guys have kind of blown up, and that's probably only going to get worse as time goes on. But you don't need a Steiff Ricky to make yourself a Didymus. You just need a similar looking plush, like this red squirrel plush I found on Amazon. This is the Ice Bear King red squirrel plush. Like the Steiff Ricky, it's got the tufted ears, it's standing on its hind legs, and best of all, it's way cheaper than the Steiff plush. This is the plush I'm going to use for this tutorial, but all of the techniques you see can be used on any squirrel plush that you can get your hands on. A bit of prep before we dive on in. This particular squirrel plush came with an acorn sewn to the paws, so I'm just snipping the thread to free that. And the acorn then gets tossed into a forgotten corner of my craft hoard, waiting for the day that I may need a tiny plush acorn. Some squirrel plush toys will also have a thread holding the tail to their body, so you might have to snip that as well so it doesn't get in the way of giving your Didymus this little outfit. I'm also going to remove the unattractive tag from the bottom of the plush. Now, you could just use a seam ripper to unpick the seam and take the tag out that way, using the ladder stitch to close up the seam. But I'm feeling lazy, so instead I use these little clippers I have, and pulling the tag taut, I snip the tag as close as I can to the thread without actually cutting it. And if I do this correctly and only cut the tag, I can wiggle it free of the plush without breaking the seam. You know, worst case scenario, you accidentally cut the thread, in which case you just pivot to the ladder stitch method. So now the plush is ready to be didymized by adding the white fur to the tail and face. I like to use yarn for this. Specifically, there's Bernat Softy Chunky White yarn, which is a nice fluffy yarn with loose fibers. I cut the yarn into pieces about 10 or so inches long, and then unwind the yarn to separate it into its individual strands. After I make a nice little pile of yarn strands, I thread the yarn into a large needle using my trusty threader tool, and then plunge the needle into the tip of the plush squirrel's tail. I'm going in one side and out the other, concentrating on the seam around the very tip of the tail. Because of all the fabric and fiber in this area, there are times where I find it handy to use a pair of pliers to provide a bit more leverage to pull my needle through the fabric. And while you're doing this, you may very well tear the strand of yarn, but don't sweat that too much. It's bound to happen because the yarn is much weaker now that we've split it into the individual strands. Now, in my experience, this fluffy yarn stays in place pretty good without any kind of glue or knot. I mean, you wouldn't want to tug on it, but it's not going to fall out by itself. As with the fiery plush, my replicas are made with adult collectors in mind, so just a disclaimer that this no-knot method is untested for durability and it might not hold up to handling by young kids. But a benefit to the no-knot method is that I can easily undo the modifications I made to my Steiff Ricky plush should I ever decide to restore him to his original body. Once I've got a decent poof I'm happy with, I take a few minutes to free some of the fur that might have gotten tangled up with the yarn. The yarn likes to grab onto other fibers as you pull it into the tail, so I'm just going through with my needle and gently tugging the tail for free. It's just to neaten things up a little bit. With that done, now we can begin the process of fluffing the yarn out so it looks more like fur. I start with a wide tooth comb and just start brushing. This is why I cut the yarn strands super long earlier, because the process of brushing out the yarn is going to break some of the yarn and drastically shorten the length of the fibers. The yarn you brush out here is good fluff for stuffing plushies, by the way, so feel free to stash this away for future use. I learned this technique from watching doll customizers on YouTube, like Mazekito and Moonlight Jewel. In their videos, they often use a pet grooming brush for brushing out the yarn, but at least with this particular yarn, I find a basic comb does a good enough job. Didymus's mustache and eyebrows are made the exact same way as the tail, threading the yarn in one side of the head and out the other. As I'm brushing out one side with the comb, I'm holding onto the other with my hand, just to make sure that I don't yank out all the yarn as I'm combing through. You can totally leave the brushed out yarn as is, but if you want your yarn to look even more like fur, you can try using an iron, or in my case this mini hair straightening iron, and do a quick pass over the yarn fibers. It's hard to see in this video, but doing this makes the yarn shiny and a bit more fur-like, and that's because this is acrylic yarn, and the heat from the iron is melting the yarn ever so slightly. So saying that, you can definitely melt the yarn too much by applying too much heat, so be careful with this step if you decide to try it out. Use the lowest amount of heat that you can, and definitely test it out on some scrap yarn first before trying it out on your plush. Though I guess this is another benefit to the no-knot method. If you do slightly melt some of the fur, you can gently tug it out and try again. And this is the point where I give my Didymus a little trim. I'm not a hairstylist, so I can't give you a lot of tips here, other than try to feather out the blunt ends of your cuts by doing this kind of random cutting into the yarn technique. I've also seen doll customizers use a little eyebrow razor to get a softer cut edge, but I didn't feel like buying one just for this, so scissors it is. The last bit of modification we're going to do to the plush squirrel is using some black embroidery thread to add a bit more detail onto the nose. You probably could consider this optional, but the one in the movie does have this detail, so I like to add it. I'm just going back and forth across the nose, and when I'm done, I pass the needle under the strands of thread that I've just sewn, so that I can tie and hide the knot of the string behind them. Even though the embroidery thread can get a little tangled in the yarn fibers, I like doing this step after adding the face fur, because adding the yarn in the cheeks can squish things around, and I worry that it might loosen the stitches of the embroidery thread. So I just do it last just to be safe. With that done, it's time to move on to making Didymus's outfit. Now, if you are using this exact same plush toy that I am, I'll help you out here and provide a pattern to download from my blog, which I'll link in the description below. This particular pattern can also be used with the original Ricky Scythe plush, FYI. Just download and print the pattern, and make sure that it printed off at the right size by checking the 1-inch marker included on the pattern against a ruler. For the folks who are using a different plush, I want to take a few minutes to explain how to come up with the pattern for your own Didymus plush. So anyone watching this video, if you want to skip ahead past the patterning, jump to the timestamp shown on screen. Didymus's tunic opens in the front, so I'm going to start by positioning the edge of the felt in the front to match that, and then based on that, I'm just going to eyeball where the first armhole should be. It's better to cut a smaller hole than you think you need, and of course you could always widen it a little later if need be. And do not worry about perfection here. This is very much a rough draft, so if it looks a little wonky, then you're doing it right. Once I've got the first armhole cut, I just wrap the felt around the body, and then once again eyeball where the second armhole should be. Pinning the front of the tunic to keep it closed, I roll down the top of the felt to start shaping the collar. And then I take a pen and just start sketching the rough shape of the tunic, referencing screenshots from the movie. At this stage, I also try and figure out the rough size and placement of all the little detail bits that we'll be adding later. Once I have a first pass done, I take the draft pattern and refine the lines a bit, and then I fold the test tunic so I can cut a symmetrical tunic shape referencing my drawn lines. As I'm cutting out the front of the tunic, I will add some additional tabs on the front. Later, when we dress our Didymus, these tabs will be folded under and then sewn together to close up the front seam. This is basically a little additional seam allowance that we're putting here. You'll likely need more than one mock-up before you're completely happy with your tunic, but once you do have something you're happy with, just transfer the pattern onto some paper and you're ready to begin making the final tunic. Here's the final pattern that I'm going to be using for my particular Didymus. I cut this one on some thicker poster paper to make it a bit sturdier, and I cut out holes where the little detail parts of Didymus's tunic will be, which will give me a guide on how they should be placed later. For Didymus's tunic, I picked up some green and red felt. I got this felt from Fabricland because I thought it might be higher quality than the felt I could find at the craft store, and I think it is. It's like slightly less shiny than the stuff I got from Michael's anyways, but honestly, especially on a camera, you really can't tell a difference. So, as long as your tunic can fit on the standard size of felt from the craft store, you probably don't need to make a special trip to the fabric store to pick some up. Didymus has these little yellow stripes on his tunic. I'm going to use a bit of broadcloth fabric I got from Fabricland in the color gold because that's what I had on hand. But I'll point out that the stripes on the Didymus in the film look to be yellow felt that are just glued directly onto the green felt. And that leads to a disclaimer that I want to add here. What follows for the tunic creation in this video is my slightly complicated method. But not only do you not have to follow that method, it would actually be more accurate to the movie to not do what I do. You can absolutely just glue some yellow felt onto some green felt, and then add red embroidery thread details over top of that. Likewise, although the method I'm about to show you uses a sewing machine, you can get a similar effect just by hand stitching. That's actually what I did for my first attempt at making the Didymus replica. I'm personally not great at hand stitching, so I prefer the look of the machine stitches, but that is just my preference. I want to encourage anyone who watches this video to make your Didymus the way you want to make it, with the materials and techniques that you want to use. All that said, let's get on with my method, which is to make little faux embroidery patches using a standard sewing machine. I'm starting on the detailed pieces that have that little strip of yellow on them. I'm tracing the cutout shape onto my yellow fabric using my trusty heat erase pen. If you haven't seen my fiery video, this pen will disappear when I apply heat to the fabric, so it's great for a project like this where I need to have a precise line drawn, but I don't want that line visible on the final fabric. I cut out some strips of the gold fabric, keeping in mind that I will need a bit of extra width around the edge of the fabric because when I sew that faux embroidery, the stitches will overlap the edge of the yellow fabric and hide the raw edges. To attach the stripes to the green felt, I'm using some stuff called Wonder Web. This is a material that has heat-activated adhesive, so you put it between your two layers of fabric and then iron it according to the directions on the package, And the result is that the two pieces of fabric are bonded together, but you can still sew through them. As opposed to something like fabric glue or just regular glue, where it would be a little hard for your needle to go through that. I'm making a bunch of these stripes at once, so I made sure to space these guys a far ways apart on the felt so I had room to sew around them. To make the faux embroidery stitch, we're doing what's called the satin stitch. Basically, this is setting your sewing machine so that the distance between your stitches, or your stitch length, is almost zero. I'm also going to adjust the width of my stitches as well, making them as large as I can make them, and set my machine to make a zigzag stitch. Altogether, what this gives you is a series of wide, close stitches that mimics an embroidered edge. I have some green thread that matches the felt pretty exactly, honestly. Is pretty lucky here. And I'm just going to start sewing. Just sewing the satin stitch onto bare felt, sometimes I've found that it results in dropped stitches, or in this case, something went a little wonky with the stitch width and it started to pull and pucker the fabric. But you can get around that by using stabilizer, which is fabric that's meant to help support the stitches while embroidering. There's different kinds of stabilizer. There's stuff that dissolves in water or stuff that you tear out. I opted for the tear out kind, although admittedly, I didn't quite like it. It doesn't tear out as cleanly as I had hoped. But I'm also not sure if it's really meant for felt, so maybe my expectations are a bit unreasonable here. I'm going to forge on ahead with this tear out stabilizer, but I'll mention that I have on occasion used plain old tissue paper as makeshift stabilizer when I'm sewing, and this stuff is definitely a lot easier to tear out at the end. After using the heat erase pen to trace the shape of each patch onto the green felt, I'm going to start sewing the satin stitch onto the shape that's easiest to sew, the green trim that goes on Didymus's pockets. Each one is made of 3 straight lines sewn with the satin stitch. You can sew each line separately, or you can sew them as one continuous line by pausing your stitch when you reach the corner and, with your needle down in the fabric, pivoting your fabric around the needle and then continuing the stitch. Just make sure you're paying attention to what side of the zigzag your needle is currently on before you make the pivot, so that you can correctly line up where the new set of stitches is going to start. The detailing on the bottom back of Didymus's jacket is next. This time we're completely encircling a vague trapezoidal shape with the sandwich stitch. This time we're completely encircling this vague trapezoidal shape with the satin stitch. And as you can see, you can manage a bit of a curve with the satin stitch, though in my case, I think I went a bit too fast around the corners and my stitches spread out quite a bit. But I think it's okay here, since this piece is solid green and my thread matches the green felt, you really don't notice the spreading too much unless you're up close. The patches on the back of the jacket, the ones with the yellow gold fabric we fused on earlier, are done the same way as the bottom back piece. Like I mentioned earlier, the satin stitch in this area overlaps with the edge of the yellow fabric to seal that raw edge in. I like to use the heat erase pen to mark just how much I want my satin stitch to overlap, just to try and keep things as even as possible when I'm sewing. Now, I personally should have set my stitch length even closer to 0. My stitches are still a bit too far apart, and you can see a fair amount of that yellow fabric between the stitches. So I'm going to solve that by simply doing another round of stitches directly over top of the original layer, but for those of you watching, just double check the length of your stitches and make sure that you're happy with what you're getting. To finish off these satin stitches, I take a needle and pull any of the dangling threads from the front of the patches and pull them to the back, knotting them on the back. With everything all neat and tidy, this is where I removed the tearaway interfacing, being very careful not to pull too hard and accidentally rip out a stitch. To give a bit of extra security with these satin stitches, I'm going to apply some fray check. Fray check is essentially a liquid sealant that binds threads together to stop fabric from fraying. It's meant to dry clear, but on certain fabrics it does leave a bit of a stain, so test it out on some scrap first and try and be sparing with the application. This is where we very carefully cut around the edge of our stitching. As you can see, I'm leaving a decent gap around the edge of the stitching, so you'll want to take that into account when you're planning the size of your patches during the patterning stage. To add the additional red stitching that's on some of the patches, I'm going to just hand stitch them on with some embroidery floss. This is another thing I like to plan out using my heat erase pen. I'm again referencing screenshots here to just kind of match the design against the one from the movie. There's probably an ideal way to sew these little crosses on, but I just kind of wing it every time. I didn't knot the embroidery floss on the back of the patch, because I was a bit worried whether or not the knot would be visible once the patch was sewn on the final tunic. So instead I used more of the fray check here, just on the very tails of the thread, so that hopefully they'll stay in place even without a knot. And that's one patch down, now on to the others. I really love this patch method for making my Didymuses. In the past, I've tried sewing the satin stitches directly onto the red tunic felt, but that meant a lot of rework if I screwed up. Whereas if I screw up one of the patches, or if it's not a good match with another patch symmetrically, I can swap it out no problem. And the ones I don't use, I can just store away for a future Didymus. Returning to the pattern we made earlier, I used the heat erase pen to mark out the shape of the tunic and the approximate position of the patches. I'm not going to cut it out yet though, I'm going to wait until after I've sewn the patches on, because I find the felt a little easier to manipulate when it's still all in one rectangular piece. And totally optional, but I decided for this Didymus that I'm going to add a little scrap of red felt to give the pockets some more dimension. I'm just going to add these on with a bit more of the Wonder Web from earlier, which does mean that I partially ironed away my heat erase pen line, but what are you going to do there? I just drew it back on once I was done. We are now finally ready to add all of our nice little patches. You can, if you want, use more Wonder Web to stick them down to the red felt. You can also use fabric glue to tack them on and be done with it. But my experience is that both the fabric glue and Wonder Web aren't the strongest, so I prefer to attach my patches with my sewing machine. So we need to reset our sewing machine back to the standard settings for the stitch length, the stitch width, and the type of stitch that we're doing. If this is your first time making the tunic, I would recommend sewing these patches on one at a time. Also, I did add a bit more tearaway interfacing under the red felt as I'm sewing. I wasn't sure if I would still run into that issue of the drop stitches, but I have since sewn this part of the tunic construction without the interfacing, so you should be okay if you want to do without it. And then I just go around sewing all my various patches in place. With the patches sewn, and in my case the tearaway interfacing removed, the tunic is ready to be cut out. Then I just give everything a quick press with the iron to remove the heat erase marker, and the tunic is ready for Didymus to wear. One thing I'll note, sewing the patches on definitely inhibits a bit of the stretch coming from the felt, so if your tunic pattern was pretty tight on your chosen squirrel plush, you might struggle a bit to get it on at this stage. But once it's on, you just need to fold under those two front tabs of the tunic, and then sew the front seam together with a ladder stitch. I will leave a link in the description on how to sew the ladder stitch for anyone who isn't familiar. After finishing the ladder stitch, but without removing my needle, I'm then going to go back and start sewing on some little gold buttons to the front of the jacket. I found these 5mm tiny gold buttons on Amazon. I wish they were slightly bigger, but these were the smallest ones I could find that were also gold. If you're struggling to find tiny gold buttons, I have had decent results simply spray painting buttons in the past. Since these aren't real working buttons, there's less risk of the paint chipping off. But I do kind of prefer having them just already be gold. I don't know, I like how much more shinier these ones are. You can sew each button separately, but I usually just do them all at once. Probably not the best way to do it, because if one button pops off, then they all will, but again, my props are meant for adult collectors, so I'm not too worried about these guys being manhandled too much. Every time I sew a button, I then just kind of sneak my needle in and then out of the tunic further down that front seam. It's a little fiddly sometimes, and the little arms of the squirrel plush gets in the way, but I honestly I kind of hate tying knots in thread, so this is my way to avoid tying a bunch of little knots and just do one continuous line of thread for all of these buttons. A quick knot behind the last button, and the tunic is ready to go. Part of why I wanted to make this video was to give my Stiph Didymus a bit of a refresh. So in addition to making a tunic for the Ice Bear King plush, I made a new tunic for my Stiph Didymus. Oh my goodness. So in addition to making a tunic for the Ice Bear King plush, I also made one for the Stiph Didymus. Stiph Didymus. Oh my goodness. I did this exactly the same way as the first, although this time I also had the idea to add a bit of iron-on interfacing onto the front flaps of the jacket, just to kind of strengthen that front seam. Sometimes I've found if you pull too hard while sewing the ladder stitch up in this area, you could tear a bit of the felt. But so long as you're gentle while sewing and pulling the thread, you should be fine. And if not, well, I have on occasion used extra buttons to cover up some of my sewing crimes in this area. For the hat, I like to keep it simple and just use these two shapes, a donut and a solid circle. Your particular hat size will depend on your specific squirrel plush, but my pieces are about 8.5 centimeters wide, with the center opening being about 3.5 centimeters wide. I'm using a bit of velvet material for my Didymus's hat. This is part of the packaging for Beauty and the Beast mirror replica that I got from the Disney store a few years ago, so that's why it's looking a little rough in parts. If you're having trouble finding velvet fabric, one trick I've used is to search for velvet pillows online or in stores. Didymus's hat is pretty small, so one pillow gives you plenty of fabric. I trace my pattern pieces out using my heat erase pen. The trace line will be where I'm sewing, so when I'm cutting out the fabric, I make sure to add a bit of seam allowance around the outer edge of each hat piece. For this inner circle of the hat, I am directly cutting on the trace line. That's because I'm going to finish off this raw edge not by sewing, but by gluing on a bit of bias tape instead. If you've never used bias tape before, it's a folded over strip of fabric that you can use to enclose a raw fabric edge. Because the fabric strip is cut on the bias, or diagonally across the normal grain of the fabric, it's got a bit of stretch to it, which is ideal for trimming curves. Generally, you're meant to sew bias tape in place, but this is a rare instance where I think you get a better result with glue. At least, I don't trust myself to sew the bias tape to this tiny inner circle. Instead, I just put a little glue on at a time, and slowly wrap the tape around the raw edge of the fabric. I like using Fabri-Tac fabric glue for this because I find it holds really fast compared to other fabric glues. When I get all the way around the edge, I cut the bias tape to length and then tuck the end under itself before gluing that bit in place as well. Now, normally I find I can sew a gathering stitch with my sewing machine and pull the threads to add some gathers, but for some reason this particular velvet fabric did not like me doing this, and the thread kept snapping. So instead, I opted to do a quick hand-gathered stitch, pulled that taut to add a bit of gathering, and then went over that hand-gathering with a machine stitch to lock everything in place. It's not ideal trying to sew over this lumpy gathered fabric, but just be careful and take it slow. And all else fails, you seam rip and you try again. Flipping things inside out completes Didymus's hat. And finally, for some reason saving the easiest part for last, Didymus's eye patch is just a bit of black felt cut to shape. I have a generic eye patch pattern that I made that I lengthen or shorten based on whatever head circumference my squirrel plush of choice has. Now, I do have white tailor's chalk that I could have used to trace the eye patch pattern onto my felt, but for the life of me I could not remember where in my craft hoard I had it stashed, so instead, here's me awkwardly trying to cut around the eye patch pattern without cutting the pattern. You can also get white heat erase markers, which I did have, and just forgot they existed. Now, I glued the straps together, but to be extra safe, I did also reinforce this with a few stitches as well. And while I got the needle out, I decided to stitch the patch to Didymus's ear, just to make sure it stayed in place. I was also a little sneaky with this particular Didymus, and added a bit of fabric glue to keep the patch on Didymus's eye. Totally optional, and for my vintage Stife Didymus plush, I opted to leave it unglued. To keep the hat in place, you could also sew it on as well, but it's also easy to use a corsage pin too. And with that, our Didymus is done, and ready for his glamour shots. Didymus is a relatively easy replica project because the hard part of making a squirrel plush is done for you. And what's left are the fun bits of customizing him and dressing him up, and you could do that in whatever way feels most approachable to you. So if you've been thinking about trying your hand at making a prop replica, maybe this one is a good place to start. And on that note, let's take a look at some replicas that other folks have made using my tutorials. First up, it's Dinosaur Flower with this adorable fiery plush. I just love how soft and huggable this one looks. Then we have Arrow Ace Get Out of My Face on Tumblr, who submitted this fiery, and I just love the mix of textures in the yarn in this one. It's so cute. I previously shared a fiery made by Dominique Bronze Art, but she recently sent me some photos of her in her Sarah costume with the fiery as an accessory, and they were just too cute not to show off as well. Squishy Lobster Plush made a fiery as well, but they did their own spin on him using faux fur instead of yarn, and it gives this fiery a really unique look. It almost looks like an official plush this way. Sarah Jane made a fiery, and mentions that her fiery was entirely hand-stitched, which I find really impressive. I definitely do not have the patience for any large hand-sewing projects, so again, I'm just really impressed to see this. Paulo Nvidia Art created this perfect fiery, and he even recorded a little making of video for his Instagram, so definitely go check him out to see the full video, and his other artwork while you're there. Then we have Dren Stardust, also known as Cryptic Cuddle Plushies, who made both a fiery and a Didymus. Isabel Turnips made a perfect little Didymus as well. And here's Zia Grea, also with a Didymus. And the fun thing about these three Didymuses is that they all used a Beanie Baby for the base plush, or in Zia's case, a teeny Beanie Baby, because her Didymus is made for an American Girl doll. The first Didymus I ever made was also using a Beanie Baby squirrel plush. So, I don't know, there's just something about seeing these three using the same plush that I did that I just find really charming. It's like all of these particular Didymuses are brothers or cousins or something like that. Thank you to everyone who submitted their replicas to me. This was by far the largest amount of submissions I've received to date. If you're wondering how folks were able to make a Didymus plush using one of my tutorials when you've been watching the Didymus tutorial, that's because they used the blog version of said tutorial, which has been out for a couple years now. I don't promote my blog a lot because, well, people don't really read blogs anymore. But there's a lot more tutorials on there that have yet to be turned into video, so if you want to peruse those archives, I will leave a link in the description. And anyways, I think that's going to be it for this one, folks. If you use one of my tutorials to make your own replica props and want to see it appear in one of my future videos, please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Blue Sky. And thanks for tuning in.